thing that truly puzzles me, and I want to stress from the beginning that this is a problem, and it's clearly a problem. I won't be, I don't think, examining the possibility that it isn't a problem, not after seeing the scenes in Ukraine and speaking to people today with family there and journalists who are there. It is the idea that people in the West, people with much bigger platforms than one might have expected. I wasn't around in the 1930s. I know that the Daily Mail was an admirer of Oswald Mosley's fascist organisation, the owner of the Daily Mail, sympathetic to some very fascistic views. Of course, the current iteration of the Daily Mail chose yesterday morning to attack the UK's intelligence services. Make of that what you will. But I wasn't around, so I've read, is it Remains of the Day, the Kazuo Ishiguro book, which details the sympathies that many aristocrats felt towards the Nazis. And it's a well-examined trope, but it's often ignored, of course, because, you know, the ruling class who were sympathetic towards Nazi ideology are still the ruling class, so they're highly unlikely to be presiding over a country in which we learn a lot, write about and read a lot about their sympathies for the ruling class. I mean, one of the most arresting images, I think, in the field of this discussion would have been the so-called Duke of Windsor, the king that abdicated, teaching his nieces to do the Sieg Heil, to do the Nazi salute in the gardens, I think, of Buckingham Palace. His nieces, of course, being Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, or the Queen, as she is currently known. That picture was published about 5 years ago, and it was genuinely staggering. No reflection at all upon the Queen, but, you know, if your uncle had been a Nazi sympathiser, you'd probably be a little bit ashamed of it, and I'm sure she is as well. But I mention this because I don't know how big the platforms were in the 1930s for people who were sympathetic to our enemies. I know that Lord Haw, William Joyce, who was of Irish extraction, had to sort of broadcast from enemy territories. He wouldn't have been given a show on British television or British radio. He certainly wouldn't have expected an American president from the 1930s or the 1920s to be extolling the genius of Adolf Hitler by the beginning of the 1940s, a former American president. It would be as if Woodrow Wilson was telling the American people that Adolf Hitler had the right idea and Franklin Delano Roosevelt had it all wrong, which is essentially what Donald Trump has done in the last week. So, and then we come to 11 Labour MPs who were warned yesterday that if they didn't remove their names from a statement about the invasion of Ukraine, which heavily criticised NATO, which is, of course, Vladimir Putin's rationale for being there, being in Ukraine, they would lose the party whip. And the 11 MPs did exactly as they were told to do by Keir Starmer within approximately an hour. 11 backbenchers told to remove their signatures from a statement drawn up by the Stop the War group. The party spokesman later said that all the MPs involved had agreed to do so. The statement accused the UK government of sabre-rattling over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It also criticised the UK government for saying that Ukraine has a right to join NATO if it so wishes. It stated that the alliance should call a halt to its eastward expansion and commit to a new security deal for Europe which meets the needs of all states and people. I mean, Diane Abbott was on the list, a few others. I haven't got the full list. I've got the full list of names in front of me. Diane Abbott, John McDonnell, the former deputy leader, Richard Bergen, Ian Lavery, Beth Winter, Zara Sultana, Belle Ribeiro, Addy, Sana Begum, Mick Whitley, Tahir Ali and Ian Mearns. In their defence, for want of a better word, the letter was assembled, I think, before the border was crossed. So it may well be that changed the nature of this fairly ludicrous intervention. You know, the idea that it's all NATO's fault or that NATO deserves heavy criticism or that Putin has a case when he complains about NATO encroachment on NATO countries that border Ukraine. There's also NATO countries that border Russia, aren't there, I think? Lithuania and Estonia, and I should always check this stuff before I say it out loud on the radio. So those are your leftist apologists for Vladimir Putin's rationale for going into Ukraine, although I stress again that this apologism was published before he crossed the border. And then you have Nigel Farage and Donald Trump, most obviously, but an awful lot of... And Tucker Carlson on Fox News, whose contributions to the conversation are being clipped up and played on Russian television at a rate of knots. Simon Marks informed us yesterday that one Russian presenter even had to say, I think, that Tucker Carlson might be going a little bit too far in his defence of Vladimir Putin. Americans might start getting suspicious. And I hate to say this because there's some brilliant journalists on the Times, and there might even be a few on the Sun. But Fox News, which is essentially a Putin propaganda tool at this point in its history, is owned by the same man that owns the Times and the Sunday Times. And, of course, the Sun newspaper. I think they might even have a radio station, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. 8 minutes after 12 is the time. Why? How does it happen? Do you get it? Do you get it? Do you understand it? Do you know how this occurs, how this unfolds? How can people on the extreme right and the extreme left, and listen, use a different word if you don't like extreme. You could say far, hard, something you're comfortable with. But people on the extreme left and the extreme right of Western politics end up essentially shilling for Vladimir Putin. And if you think I'm exaggerating, here's a little clip from Russia Today, which is, literally a propaganda arm of Vladimir Putin's Kremlin.
But not everybody is piling the blame on Russia for this here. We have heard from some politicians, such as British politician Nigel Farage, and also from presidential hopeful candidate Eric Zemmour, that partly the blame must be laid at the door of the West.
How has that happened? I mean, it's no surprise to me. I was pretty clear about who he was and what he represented a long time ago. Seeing his name trend on Twitter last night, accompanied by the phrase Lord Haw-Haw, was once again not particularly enjoyable, because it's a little bit like the boy who spent 5 years pointing at the naked emperor, being expected to celebrate that it took 5 years for everybody else to realise that he was naked. But how does that happen? How do people on the left and the far right of British politics or American politics end up shilling for Vladimir Putin? If you want to have a crack at answering that, then I'll give you the money myself. 034560 60973 is the number you need. It's also a useful illustration that the Labour leader Keir Starmer has adopted a rather different approach to matters than his predecessor. And later today, in fact, you can already access it, but I'll play you later this hour a little bit of the interview I conducted with Keir Starmer on Monday night. I think it might be one of the most in-depth and revealing interviews he's ever done. In fact, if I was of a less modest disposition, I'd suggest that it was the most revealing and personal interview that he's ever done. But I will leave you to judge for yourself. It's available wherever you get your podcasts, over at Global Player app in the first instance. And in answer to the question of how the far right end up on Putin's side, we have to return, and this trended as well yesterday. I think we might have been responsible for kicking it up the agenda on social media. We have to return to that business that we played out yesterday of Steve Bannon, who of course was Donald Trump's chief strategic advisor, or however he was described, also someone described as grooming Jacob Rees-Mogg at one point in the tricks and tactics of far-right politics. What else could you describe him? Well, Nigel Farage's hero, described by Nigel Farage as a man without whom Brexit never would have happened. Jacob Rees-Mogg's groomer, if reports of him offering advice on achieving party leadership a few years ago in this country. Vladimir Putin fanboy. That's just a statement of fact. And, of course, a former board member of Cambridge Analytica, which many people in the British political establishment continue to deny played any role whatsoever in infiltrating your nan's Facebook page and persuading her to vote for to become the only country in the history of humanity to impose economic sanctions on itself. So here is a little reminder of perhaps the beginning of an answer to this. I haven't heard anybody sensible in this country yet suggesting that gender-neutral toilets or this weird right-wing obsession with people who want to change their pronouns on social media might have played a part in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. But here is a man who was, among the most powerful in the world under the early days of Donald Trump's presidency, talking to a bloke called Eric Prince, who I've forgotten what he does. I think he owns something.
Putin ain't woke. He is anti-woke.
The Russians, people still know which bathroom to use.
They know how many genders are there in Russia?
2.
Okay, that's all of a sudden. That's not. They don't have the flags. They don't have the pride flags outside on their.
They don't have boys swimming in girls' college swim meets.
How backward.
It's embarrassing.
How savage. How medieval. How medieval. This is why this whole thing's a scam. It's a total and complete scam.
Grown men there suggesting that gender-neutral toilets or other issues that only the right-wing obsess about. You find a couple of students in the middle of nowhere marching a protest about something, and next thing you know, it's got 12 pages of coverage in the right-wing national newspapers, and people are shouting about it on the radio, despite no one can ever name the people who are supposed to be at the heart of the problem, a bit like Black Lives Matter. Eric Prince owns Blackwater, which is a private military company in America. So how do people like that end up supporting Vladimir Putin? Is it really because they're so cripplingly insecure in their own masculinity or sexuality or whatever it may be that they honestly look at Vladimir Putin and see a daddy figure? Is it, I mean, I'm just speculating because I haven't got any obvious answers to the question. What do people like Diane Abbott, what leads people like Diane Abbott to support Vladimir Putin's position on Ukraine, and what leads people like Nigel Farage and Steve Bannon to support Vladimir Putin's position on Ukraine? It's not going to be the same things, is it? I do think with people like Bannon and Farage, they're so... I don't know if you heard Steve Bannon have a go at our very own Theo Osherwood once. We've got the tape of that knocking around somewhere. But they are so fragile. All the people that use words like snowflake or woke, they're terrified of their own shadows. Imagine being worried about who can and as a man, imagine being worried about who can and can't use a toilet. I've heard people in this studio complain about gender-neutral toilets without mentioning that there's one 14 yards away from where I'm sitting now and where they're sitting when they're getting cross about gender-neutral toilets. But is that just a red herring? I mean, no one's really that pathetic, are they? I'm a fan of Vladimir Putin because he's quite homophobic and so am I. Is that the thing? Is it that simple? What do the right see in him? Why would they behave in such a treacherous fashion and end up offering support to an enemy of their own country? And why would people on the left also suggest that Putin's analysis of NATO is accurate while their own countrymen's analysis is somehow bogus? I'll take any answer you've got, but we'll speak after this to a former diplomat who has some very insightful comments to make on some of these issues. 12:15 is the time. 12:19 is the time. What is it about figures, or what is it about Vladimir Putin that draws figures from the far right and the far left of British and American politics? Certainly American politics on the far right. I don't know enough about American politics to say whether they have their equivalent on the far left to effectively shill for him. Is a question that we're going to be addressing between now and 1 o'clock. The number you need to offer up your answer is 03456060973 is the number that you need. And I mean, it's a statement of fact, I'm afraid. I know some people from either camp will be unhappy with it, but these 11 Labour MPs put their names to a statement that heavily criticised NATO and called for a halt to its eastward expansion, and that is almost verbatim the rationale that Vladimir Putin has used to justify his invasion of Ukraine. Again, I stress, in defence of the 11 backbenchers who removed their signatures from that statement. It was signed before the incursion had been made. I'm joined now by Andrew Levy, who's a former British diplomat posted to Russia, who was responsible for reviewing Russian policy for the British government after the invasion of Georgia in 2008. And we'll begin, if we may, Andrew, with the origins of this idea that NATO expansion was a real and present danger to Vladimir Putin's Russia, and B, something that people in the West could have joined in with, could have jumped aboard.
Yeah, hi, James.
Hello.
Thanks for having me on. I'm afraid I haven't been listening to the show today.
What? Well, that's it. Finished. Cut. Finished. Done.
So I hope I don't cut across anything that was said before. Look, Vladimir Putin doesn't think it's about NATO.
No.
In his really pretty crazy statement that he gave to justify the invasion on the early hours of Thursday morning, he sort of mentioned NATO in paragraph 978 or something. His main point was Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist, but his real point, which he wasn't saying and that he knows, is that he's a kleptocrat. He is a psychopath. He may not realize that, but he's in that position. He knows he's in danger, and he has to escalate his theft and his political manipulation and his violence over time. We've seen it with many others, and he knows those examples. Colonel Gaddafi, where did Colonel Gaddafi die? Ceausescu, where did Ceausescu die? And he fears that, quite rightly. And so he's in a cycle of escalation, and theft doesn't just include theft of resources in his own country, it includes theft of territory. Now, all this mysticism about Ukraine being part of Russia, whatever, it's basically rubbish, but, even historically, it's nonsense. But now Ukraine is a sovereign state. It's a member of the United Nations, and he's launched a war of aggression. Okay, and against the Nuremberg principles, he is a war criminal. This will have to be done by the proper lawyers and so on. So he's in an even greater escalation now. And this is only going to get worse unless he's stopped. But he has nuclear weapons. So there we are.
I tell a story on your Twitter account last night, going right back to 2008, which, of course, is and shortly after Putin invaded Georgia. And, it's fair to say that every syllable of the advice you gave to the then Foreign Secretary has been borne out by events. Why was more notice not paid to people like you?
So, to be fair to the Foreign Secretary at the time and the Prime Minister at the time, I think they did take notice, and some very senior officials, some excellent ones, did take notice. So just to be fair.
Okay.
I think what's happened is, there's a mixture of fear, foolishness, wishful thinking, and that sort of thing, and in many cases, greed. Some people are, whether it's people, lawyers and others who make a lot of money out of it, or whether it's people who've been paid off to be literally agents of Putin's regime, these things motivate. Yeah.
Are you suggesting that if there hadn't been a change of government in 2010, then things might have gone better? And I'm conscious of you not being able to go into certain areas of conversation.
Of course, it's always hard to do the
2020 hindsight. Yes, of course.
I was like many people. I've been talking to a lot of people recently. Dismayed, but not just by much of what the British government did or didn't do. And to be fair, the British government did do some things. It's not all bad. But do you remember Hillary Clinton's reset when she was Secretary of State? Her supposed reset with Sergei Lavrov and all this stuff. It's just entirely unrealistic. It doesn't relate to what the Putin regime is. He isn't a normal, politician.
They're playing Queensberry rules with a street fighter, aren't they?
That's right. Now, the thing is, he has nuclear weapons.
Yes. Right?
And so if you go for a reset like Hillary Clinton did, of course she's not a fool. None of these people are totally sort of foolish. You're trying to maneuver your way through a situation where you believe, as the Americans believed and the British believed and other allies, that you were not going to be able to pull together an alliance for total containment of Putin. In the Cold War, we had a containment policy. The USSR was nuclear armed. The difference in the Cold War, and it was extremely dangerous back then, but the difference was you didn't have a mafia boss in charge of Russia. You had people who had a pretty nasty ideology, in my opinion, but who had, as they say in diplomacy, raison d'etat, right? The state mattered. Putin is the state. Putin and his several dozen mafia cronies are the state. There's no distinction. They own the state. And that's the difference. They don't care about anything else.
So I wonder whether some of the leftist, and this is what we're going to be discussing for the rest of the hour, it may not be something you're comfortable commenting on, but some of the leftist support for Putin's analysis of NATO expansionism and the rationale for intervention in Ukraine is built upon a failure to understand the difference between the ideologues, the nasty ideologues, and Putin's regime. It's not a case of supporting the ideology of post-war Soviet communism. Putin represents something completely different and much, much uglier.
I think there are some people who have a strange attachment to the Soviet Union. Yes. I think it's but an even stranger lack of recognition that this isn't the Soviet Union.
Yes, exactly.
However, I don't think that's the only thing. I think there's a very profound anti-Americanism. Now, I say that might sound pejorative. Look, it's if you want to be anti-American, right? The Americans are the reason we've had it so good for 75 years. Of course, our own efforts, right? Our collaboration in the EU, countries getting together, trying to do the right thing. But without the US, it all wouldn't have been there. And doesn't mean the US hasn't made horrific mistakes and done terrible things. So if you believe that and you don't like the way our society is and how we exploit other countries and all this sort of thing, you would be anti anything that our alliance does. And I can understand that.
Yes.
But I think it's a personally a rather peculiar view of life, and it's not very helpful to us in the UK or Germany or elsewhere.
Sure. And finally, Andrew Levy, a word, if you would, on how the events of the last 24 hours explain pretty much completely why every Central and Eastern European country has been determined in recent years to join NATO.
Yeah, what you've seen with this war of aggression and this invasion is precisely what every single Central and Eastern European foreign secretary and prime minister and so on has known, and why they wanted to join NATO in the first place. And if anybody was in any doubt, here you have Ukraine, a member of the United Nations, a sovereign, independent country, not a member of NATO, being invaded.
And that is, I mean, stark, because, of course, it leaves them alone, as we've been discussing since the early hours of yesterday morning. They don't have the power of treaties backing up their position.
Well, I mean, they don't have the power of the NATO alliance. They do actually have the power of treaties backing up their position, but those are being broken by Russia.
You mean Budapest, but that's been chucked in the bin, hasn't it?
Been chucked in the bin, and also the Helsinki Accord. Basically, everything has been chucked in the bin.
Whereas NATO has a heft that treaties like Helsinki and Budapest simply don't.
Putin has explicitly, specifically threatened nuclear war should we, NATO, any other country, try to help Ukraine. That is literally what it is. There's nuclear terrorism. That is what is happening right now.
Crikey. Andrew Levy, many thanks indeed. I'm saying thank you for the quality of your contribution. It hasn't improved my mood much.
I'm a ray of sunshine, James. But I'm sorry I couldn't quite manage it today.
We'll do this again. Thank you. Your first time on the show, and I sincerely hope not your last. Andrew Levy there, former diplomat with particular experience of the Russian question, including, as you heard, briefing the British Foreign Secretary shortly after the birth of his baby son, actually, and shortly after the invasion of Georgia by Vladimir Putin. It's coming up to 12:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. 33 minutes after 12 is the time. So the beginnings of an answer to the question of how people on the hard left of British politics could end up essentially endorsing Vladimir Putin's analysis of NATO expansionism and the grounds for, if not invasion of Ukraine, then certainly escalations there. And that would be a failure properly to understand. So, I mean, for my money, a mistaken regard for the Soviet Union, for the post-war Russian state. But you know this. You know that there are people in the Labour movement, because they became very prominent briefly after 2015, who held Joseph Stalin in relatively high regard. So there's no surprises there, but a failure to understand that support for that disgusting regime is very different to support for Vladimir Putin's disgusting regime. So that makes a little bit of sense. And then you've got what is accurately described as anti-Americanism, with, of course, the qualification that America has done some awful, awful things. It's a bit like letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. This isn't my opinion. This is an explanation of other people's opinions. So because America has exploited and marched into so many countries in protection of America's interests, then America is the enemy, even though America's interests were aligned for the large part with British interests. Again, explanation, not excuse. But apart from Steve Bannon being terrified of toilets, why would people on the far right end up shilling for Vladimir Putin? Nigel Farage, as we established long ago on this programme, doesn't really believe in anything except Nigel Farage. So, you know, if you asked him what his values were, it would be sort of warm beer and a village cricket or something like that. I don't know. But how does he end up endorsing Vladimir Putin's position in a manner that many people have compared to Lord Haw, the famous Nazi propagandist of the Second World War? 12:35 is the time. What do you reckon? How do people on the far right and the far left end up singing very similarly from the Vladimir Putin hymn sheet? Al's in Bristol to kick things off. Al, what do you think?
Hello, James.
Hello, Al.
First-time caller.
Well, you've picked one, haven't you?
Yes. And not sure if I'm going to make a bit of a dog's breakfast of this.
Well, you'll be in good company. You'll be in good company if you do. Carry on.
Have a go answering this question. To me, it seems as if those on the far right and the far left in sort of Western political discourse want to sort of attempt to justify the invasion of Ukraine.
Yes.
From two sort of angles, and they're completely different. But for I think it's their sort of general hostility to this idea of NATO expanding and it being a passively warmongering sort of organisation that, while its intentions are good, it aggravates a country like Russia, particularly with a neighbour such as Ukraine, who may be seeking to join that organisation. And for the far left, they'll say, well, this is why, Ukraine's been invaded. It's NATO's expansion.
Well, they said that. They said, we refute the idea that NATO is a defensive alliance. That's what they said in the letter. But they weren't in favour of the invasion of Ukraine, but they were or maybe they were, actually. I need to check the timings, but that fits your analysis perfectly, doesn't it? They wrote, we refute the idea that NATO is a defensive alliance, as of course does Vladimir Putin.
Sure, and I think that sits in with a sort of general position taken by those on the far left that, war is something to be avoided at all cost, and, Western governments shouldn't be sticking their oars in other parts of the world. And that sort of general narrative, and I think that's why they're seeking to justify.
And sometimes that's true. Some wars are mistakes, retrospectively. Some wars never should have been undertaken. But you're talking about an extremist position that's opposed to all of them.
That's right. And then jumping to the other side of the sort of political spectrum, to the far right.
Yeah, which is, I think, for me, more mysterious, to be honest with you.
I think it is, and arguably more ludicrous. And that's they're sort of saying, well, it's the erosion of Western cultural norms that have taken place in recent times in places like Britain and America, and that's just perceived as weakness by the Russians, and that's why they've invaded, because they think it's an optimum time. The West is running around in circles.
Tell me what you mean by cultural norms. What are these people upset or frightened or cross about?
Well, it's the same people that want to, call the government the thought police, or people that don't think expanding and improving, rights and opportunities for underrepresented groups and the expansion of LGBTQ rights and sort of championing.
Which fits with what Steve Bannon was saying, doesn't it? And so it is people who think that the attempts to protect minorities from persecution are a problem. That's who we're talking about now. And because Vladimir Putin's a big fan of persecuting minorities, people in Britain who resent attempts to stop the persecution of minorities are big fans of Vladimir Putin. That's actually quite straightforward, isn't it?
Yeah, that's sort of where I've got to with it. Yeah. But I guess it's different shades, but I think that those might be the justifications.
So we like Vladimir Putin because he hates gays and ethnics?
Well, I mean... that's a very, very blunt way of putting it. But I think when you get down to the they see these sort of developments and these improvements in the West as actually a sign of
and then we're back to the question of what does woke actually mean, and what are these people really frightened of? And that fits perfectly with your analysis. I like that. That's a sparkling debut, Al.
Oh, thank you very much, James.
No dog's breakfast. No dog's breakfast in sight. No dogs, not even a Rice Krispie. I love that. Thank you. Of course, you can dispute that, of course. The reason why I, as a as a British patriot, support Vladimir Putin has nothing to do with the fact that I'm terrified of my own sexuality and frightened of change. 03456060973 is the number that you need. So, I mean, is it that simple? Is it? And because I don't like thinking that Steve Bannon speaks for a significant part of the population, because he speaks such obvious bilge. Nasty, divisive, racist bilge. And they always bring transgender issues into it, because transgender issues are truly complicated, in my humble opinion. You might find it incredibly simple to understand. I find them truly complicated, whereas all the other bigotries and prejudices endorsed by people like Steve Bannon are unerringly simple. Gay people deserve exactly the same rights and representation as straight people. Black people deserve exactly the same representations and rights as white people. Women deserve exactly the same representations and rights as men. But if you're uncomfortable with any of this, and goodness knows if we've learned anything over the last few years, we've learned that a lot of people are, then I can just about see how you'd be so desperate to show your support to a world leader who is explicitly homophobic and racist and sexist and misogynist and all the rest of it, that you'd end up cheering him as he invaded Ukraine. What about Farage? How does Farage end up on this spectrum? Which sort of part of this analysis fits Nigel Farage's decision to offer up support for a man regarded almost everywhere else on the British political spectrum as coming very close to meriting comparisons with Adolf Hitler? Lara is in Portrush in Northern Ireland. Lara, what would you like to say?
Yes, I mean, I have been following American politics quite a lot over the last year, and I think the direction of travel there is really quite concerning. You have Donald Trump narrowly losing the election to Biden, and the percentage of people in America that still would follow him despite some of the outrageous things.
Well, hang on, your phone line went then. Just go back about 8 words.
Oh, I said...
And stop scratching your ears while you're talking to me.
I can assure you I'm not, but I will try and keep more still. I think that Donald Trump doesn't care a hoot about gay issues or transgender issues. However, he has recognised that there are a lot of people in America who are concerned by these things and get very worked up about them for no apparent reason. And so he's tapped into that, and it's a populist approach. And I think, therefore, Tucker Carlson is just...
He's a Fox News presenter for people lucky enough not to know that.
And he's taken that ball and is running with it.
Why? Just tell me why again. Sorry, I wasn't distracted. I just want to hear it in neat and digestible language. Why would a Fox News presenter be doing Vladimir Putin's propaganda on a television station that was loyal to Donald Trump and is owned by Rupert Murdoch?
Well, I mean, this is just my opinion.
No, of course it is.
I'm not an expert, but what I think is that Donald Trump nailed his math sort of to Putin and has hailed him as being this great, strong leader.
Okay, so it's just tribalism then. It's just footballification. He's got the Donald Trump scarf tied so tightly round his neck, he has to come out in support of Vladimir Putin. Sure,
as does Nigel Farage. I mean, he and Trump are sort of nailed together or joined at the hip. So I think it suits their political ideology. I think they're trying to move towards. I mean, Donald Trump would love to be a Mussolini or
that's a little bit. That's a little bit harsh. He wouldn't want an Italian name. Oh, hang on, he's got a French one. So I was going to say
he's got European blood.
So are we over-analysing it slightly? It is simply the case of I'm all for oppression as long as I'm not the one being oppressed.
Oh, absolutely, and I think that they can see that Putin is basically a dictator, and they would Donald Trump would certainly quite like to be a dictator.
There's a fondness for authoritarianism, isn't there, on the extremes of both the left and the right? We've seen it a little bit in recent years in Britain. The idea that if you don't 100% sign up, then you are ideologically impure and should be excised from the public space completely. And then on the right, it's a case of literally you shouldn't be allowed to protest. I mean, Conservative MPs complaining about Russians being rounded up as they protest against Putin's actions are going to have a few questions to answer when it comes to their next opportunity to vote against measures to make that kind of protest illegal in this country, aren't they? It's a funny old world.
Yes, indeed. And as for the Diane Abbotts of this...
Don't say Diane Abbott. Let's say Richard Bergen and John McDonnell, because Diane takes way more than her fair share of it. My fault, this. I shouldn't have used her as the most obvious example.
I actually quite like her.
I quite like her as well in many ways. So John McDonnell and Richard Bergen and colleagues.
Any of them. I think they still have this romantic ideology of Russia as being this socialist sort of vanguard country, and that they haven't really realised that Putin is just a right-wing dictator.
Yes, he is exactly that. They're just a bit dopey, bless them. And thankfully they wound their necks right in as soon as Keir Starmer insisted that they join the real world temporarily. Of course, the fact that they still enjoy the Labour whip meant that he had leverage to exercise over them. That's brilliant. Thank you, Laura. I'm getting it now. I really am. 12:45 is the time. 12:49 is the time, and it is now time to give you a little sneak preview of, unless you were there on Monday night, of course, we raised over £20,000 for Global's Make Some Noise, a charity that supports charities up and down the country, 100 I think this year, all working in your communities to help people most in need of help. So thank you for that. I know the tickets were quite steep, which priced a lot of people out of proceedings, but every penny raised goes to Global Make Some Noise, and we raised over £20,000 on a single night. And my guest, as you may have picked up over the course of the week, was Keir Starmer, and that interview is now available for you to listen to. Something for the weekend, as the barber used to say. Before I did it, I asked a couple of people, Theo Usherwood included, for a steer or a bit of guidance, and almost everybody said to me, I just try and find out a bit more of a human side to him, and I think I understood why. It's that loyally exterior, and I came to such a profound understanding of what drives him in the course of that interview, and I think a lot of people in the audience did as well, and I really liked what I saw. But when it comes to humanity, I think we did pretty well on that score as well. So we cover an awful lot of ground in the interview. You can get it from Global Player. It's called Full Disclosure. So it's a wonderful series. We've interviewed an incredible array of people. But here is just a little taste of my hour-long, in-depth interview with Keir Starmer that's available today. There's a line I've read from your dad when you got your knighthood, when he said they treated Keir like a lord, and they treated us like a lord's mum and dad.
Yeah. My mum and dad, they guessing when I got the knighthood at Buckingham Palace, and to some extent, all of that was about them and the pride that they had in that. They turned up. They, very typical of my mum and dad, I'm afraid. They by then they got a Great Dane, and the animals came first. My mum couldn't walk at that stage, so they had to take a car into Buckingham Palace, which is quite unusual, because by then she'd lost the ability to walk. And so they've got this sort of beaten-up old Volvo with a Great Dane in the back, which they've not cleared with security. And they've driven to the gates of Buckingham Palace, winding down the window, saying, "We're here for Keir's knighthood." So sort of security, but pretty nonchalant. The corgis were out, and so it's just, and in the end, I think they cajoled one of the staff to sort of look after the Great Dane whilst they were in, watching me. But for them, it was an amazing moment of real pride for them, and very special in that respect, because, again, they would have never expected their son to be getting knighted at Buckingham Palace. It was just not something that would ever have happened.
So a vindication of all of the hopes of their parenting.
And my dad in particular wasn't very good at showing pride.
No.
And not in himself, not in us. And so it was glimpsing it first-hand in that was really good. But as for bringing the Great Dane, absolutely, it didn't cross their mind that this would be a problem. They said, well, everybody loves dogs. We'll just drive the dog into Buckingham Palace and park the car up.
We did a lot more laughing than I think we were than I was expecting. I know the audience as well at times. There's some proper laughs there. Keir Starmer there on this week's episode of Full Disclosure, which you can download from Global Player app or wherever you get your podcasts. And I know I recommend it every week, but obviously he's the leader of the opposition. He is one of only two people in with a chance of being the next... Well, no, that's not quite true, is it? One of How do you phrase it then? Because you can't say one of only 2 people in with a chance of being our next Prime Minister, because half the Conservative cabinet is in with a chance of being our next Prime Minister, arguably before Keir Starmer even gets a chance. But he is the only... Well, he's the only leader of the opposition. There you go. That's not as catchy or as pithy. And speaking of Prime Minister Boris Johnson, I've got some footage to play you from an exchange he had with the chair of the Defence Select Committee just a few months ago that I mean, God, it's from last November. And if ever, I mean, having him in charge of fighting a global pandemic was bad enough. Having him in charge as war in Europe begins to rage is absolutely terrifying, and not just for the reasons that I'll share with you in about 2 minutes' time, which is a warning to you, Eldin, in Birmingham, that you need to make your contribution in approximately 2 minutes, if you can. What would you like to say about what draws the left and or the right to Vladimir Putin's support at times like this?
Yeah, hi, James.
Hello, mate.
Thanks for having me. I just wanted to start at, obviously it's appalling what's happening there in Ukraine, of course. I don't think anybody sane or in this country in particular is supporting what's happening. And I will obviously make a counter-argument that I disagree with you that the left actually supports Putin in any way.
Well, they support his analysis of NATO. That's as far as I went, which is...
Well, that's not supporting them.
It kind of is. If his analysis of NATO is one of his reasons for invading Ukraine, I think it's problematic.
Well, NATO has made a couple of mistakes here and there, and that's what they mean by it.
But if you're picking a side between NATO and Putin, then, I mean, it should be a bit of a no-brainer, shouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, if anything supported Putin, it's Tony Blair and whoever went to, on his inauguration in late 90s or early noughties.
There's a lot of optimism then that he would turn out to... No, I mean, that's a conversation we can have, but I don't think Putin in inauguration time had anything like the indications that he was going to turn out like he is today.
Of course there was.
Well, okay, I mean...
Just look what's happening in the Bosnian war in the 90s when the Russian mercenaries were killing babies, and Britain just looked on and supported him.
So we're not, as I said, I mentioned we had 2 minutes. Are we going to spend any of it discussing the conversation that you rang in to contribute to?
Of course, yeah.
You've got 20 seconds. 20 seconds now. What is it that draws far-right figures to Vladimir Putin's side?
I think they're just like them. Give them power, they will do the same thing.
It's a genuine fan club, then. They love what he's doing because given the opportunity, they do the same.
He was going that way.
Yeah.
Give Farage the power of Putin, he will be worse.
I can't argue with that bit. It's certainly, I find that bit actually hilarious. The idea that Trump shills now suggesting, imagine if Trump had been in charge, Putin, I've got to say it correctly, would never have undertaken this. The idea that a man who incited a coup in his own country would somehow be an obstacle to another world leader, a world leader that he has expressed his admiration of, invading another country is objectively hilarious. But hey-ho, probably not a time for comedy. There's certainly nothing funny about this exchange between Boris Johnson and the chair of the Defence Select Committee from just 3 months ago.
If you're saying, Mr. Elwood, that you think we should go back and prepare for tank battles in...
no, you're putting words into my mouth.
I don't know but you're saying that you mentioned...
But you mentioned tanks.
On the European
we are cutting back on our tanks. What is amassing on the Russian border right now, on the Ukrainian border? It's tanks, arguably enough. Well, but that's besides the point. I'm saying step back, look at the wider security picture, look at our defence posture and see what needs to be done.
If you think that UK tanks are the answer...
No, now you're going down and out.
You're saying that we should commit UK tanks to the defence of Ukraine.
No. You deliberately... I'm sorry. I'm really sorry you're taking us down this rabbit hole, because you know perfectly well it's not about
I'm not taking you down a rabbit hole.
Tanks are one element of a wide spectrum of our defence capability.
You brought up tanks, Mr. Elwood.
Tanks.
You brought up
aircraft. 48 aircraft, F-35s. You promised 138. You've cut back to 48. You cut back on not just tanks. Warriors have been removed completely. Hercules aircraft removed completely. And then 10,000 troopers have been removed. So we can talk about tanks, or we can talk about the wider spectrum of capabilities that have been reduced. At the very time I'm trying to make clear that there are bigger threats coming over the horizon.
Yes, Prime Minister. And I think what I'm trying to make clear is I think that it's now or never for the UK armed forces. We have to recognise that the old concepts of fighting big tank battles on the European landmass, which I think is what you're driving at, are over, and there are other better things that we should be investing in the FCAS, in the Future Combat Air System, in cyber. This is how warfare of the future is going to be fought in our advanced early warning systems, and that is where we need to be. I think that the investments that we are making,
you can't hold ground with cyber.
In new technology are absolutely indispensable to our ability to fight the wars of the 21st century. And I don't think that going back to a 1940s style approach will serve us well.
Boris Johnson there in November of last year, stating that the old concepts of fighting big tank battles on European landmass are over, while going on to mock the idea of armed conflict returning to Europe. In his defence, he didn't mock it quite as passionately as he did during the referendum campaign, when it was suggested that leaving the European Union might jeopardise peace in Europe and raise the prospect of the sort of armed conflict that is happening right now, returning to Europe.